Alara had learned early in life that the best way to survive was to be invisible. She moved through the marble halls of the palace like a shadow, head down, steps quiet, eyes fixed on the floor in front of her. She knew which tiles creaked and which ones held silence. She knew when the guards changed shifts and which hallways were empty during the royal hour. 7 years of living inside these walls had taught her everything she needed to know about not being seen. She did not mind it. Being noticed had never brought her anything good. The palace of King Calum Dracon was a place of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary coldness. Tall stone arches stretched toward painted ceilings. Golden light fell through narrow windows onto floors, so clean they reflected the sky. Every room was perfect. Every servant was trained to perfection. And at the center of all of it sat a king who ruled with a kind of authority that made even the bravest men careful about how they spoke in his presence. Alara had seen him only a handful of times in 7 years. Each time, she had done what she always did, stepped aside, lowered her eyes, and disappeared before he had a reason to notice her. Until the morning everything changed. She was carrying a stack of fresh linens down the corridor that led to the east wing when she turned a corner and walked directly into the path of the king and his 4 guards. The collision did not happen. She stopped just in time, but the linens shifted in her arms, and one small cloth fell to the floor. In the process of catching it, the wrapping around her left wrist loosened. She fixed it immediately, or she thought she had. Calum's eyes moved to her wrist for a fraction of a second. Then they moved to her face. She dropped her gaze to the floor and stepped aside. He walked past. She breathed again. But for the rest of that day, she kept one hand pressed firmly against her wrist, just to be certain. King Calum had spent the last 6 years building something no alpha before him had managed, a unified realm. 5 wolf packs and 3 Fey bloodlines, all of whom had spent centuries trying to destroy one another, now sat under one crown. It had cost him sleep, time, and the better part of his youth. He had given everything to the realm, and kept almost nothing for himself. His advisors told him it was time to give one more thing: a queen. They chose Princess Seraphine of the Eastern Court, and they were not wrong to. She was everything a queen was supposed to be. She was educated and composed, and politically intelligent. Her family's alliance would strengthen 3 border regions. Her bloodline satisfied every requirement written in the royal law books. Calum accepted the arrangement without argument. He had long since stopped expecting his life to include things he actually wanted. The engagement was announced on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, the palace had transformed into something resembling a festival. Flowers were arranged in towers. Banners were hung from every available surface. Musicians were brought in from 4 different kingdoms. Seraphine arrived with a retinue of 40, and smiled at everything and everyone with the patience of a woman who had been trained since childhood for exactly this moment. Calum watched the preparations from a distance and felt nothing in particular. He told himself this was fine. He had never needed to feel anything. He only needed to function. The wedding took place under a full moon, as tradition required. Vows were spoken in the old language. Rings were exchanged. The crowd cheered. Seraphine was luminous in white and gold, and she smiled at him across the altar with perfect warmth, and he smiled back with the same careful expression he used in diplomatic meetings. That night, unable to sleep, he stood on the palace balcony and looked out at the dark garden below. He heard footsteps, soft and unhurried, the kind that belonged to someone who had no reason to expect anyone else to be there. A young woman stepped onto the far end of the balcony and reached for a forgotten serving tray that had been left on the stone railing. She picked it up. She turned to leave, and then she stopped, because she realized she was not alone. She looked at him. He looked at her. He recognized her, the maid from the corridor, the one whose wrist wrapping had come loose. In the moonlight he could see her more clearly than he had before. She was not remarkable in any obvious way. She was young, perhaps 20, with dark eyes and an expression that gave away nothing except a kind of quiet watchfulness that he recognized instinctively because he wore the same expression himself. They stood in silence for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then, without a word, she turned and walked back inside. He stood on the balcony for another hour after she left, staring at nothing, with the strangest feeling that something significant had just happened. though he could not have explained what or why. Ilara had a gift she had never asked for, and spent most of her energy hiding. The mark on her left wrist had been there since birth. The woman who raised her, a strict but quietly kind housekeeper named Gerda, had rapped it on her very first day at the palace, and told her in a low, firm voice, "Keep this covered. Always. Do you understand me?" Ilara had been 13, and frightened, and far from anywhere she knew. She had nodded. She had kept it covered for 7 years. She did not know exactly what the mark was. She knew only that it sometimes glowed, faintly, like light seen through thin cloth, when she was emotional. And that the one time a stable boy had accidentally seen it, he had gone pale and crossed himself, and refused to speak to her for 3 weeks afterward. She had learned to be careful. But the mark, it turned out, had its own ideas. It happened during a confrontation between 2 visiting nobles in the East Corridor, a shouting match that turned briefly physical before the guards intervened. Ilara had been passing through and had pressed herself against the wall to avoid the chaos. When a guard shoved one of the nobles backward and the noble's arm swung out, his hand caught her wrist. The wrapping tore loose and fell to the floor. The mark blazed. It was only visible for a few seconds before she snatched the cloth back up and covered it. But one person saw it clearly. An elder, a small, gray-haired man in council robes, was standing at the end of the corridor. His eyes went straight to her wrist. His face changed in a way she had seen only once before, on Gerda's face, the night she told her to keep it covered. It was not curiosity. It was recognition, and it was fear. He turned and walked away quickly. Ilara stood alone in the corridor for a long moment, her heart beating too fast, and then she tucked the cloth tight and went back to work. That night, she thought about leaving the palace. She had thought about it before. She had never done it, because she had nowhere to go. The Council of Seers met in the lower chamber of the sacred vault before dawn. 7 elders sat around the old stone table, and the one who had seen Ilara's mark told the others what he had witnessed. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when people hear something they were not prepared for. They sent for Marin. Marin was 80 years old and had not spoken a formal prophecy in 4 decades. She lived alone in a small stone house at the edge of the palace grounds, and she came only when she chose to, which was rarely. She arrived at the vault an hour before sunrise, moving slowly, and without apparent hurry, a walking stick in one hand. They led her to the ancient inscription carved into the stone wall, the prophecy that the entire realm had built its expectations around. She placed her fingers on the carved letters, and stayed still for a long time. Then she asked about the mark. The elder described it in detail. Marin was quiet for another long moment, and then she said simply that they had been reading the prophecy incorrectly for 300 years. The word that had been translated as noble blood did not mean a titled family. In the oldest form of their language, older than the kingdoms themselves, it meant something closer to original source. It referred to a bloodline, yes, but not the bloodline of kings. It referred to the bloodline of the first Alpha, the origin from which all shifter power had come, long before there were palaces or councils or crowns. That line had been presumed dead. The mark on Ilara's wrist told a different story. The elders argued for the rest of the night. Some said this changed nothing, that the marriage was made, the alliance was sealed, and reopening the question would cause damage that could not be undone. Others said that ignoring the true prophecy was a far greater risk. Marin did not participate in the argument. She had said what she came to say. She went home. Calum discovered the truth through his own investigation, independent of the council. He had spent 3 weeks quietly pulling records, orphan registrations, lineage documents, ancient bloodline charts, and had reached the same conclusion the elders had reached. He confirmed it by going directly to Gerda, the old housekeeper, who wept when she finally told him what she had known for 7 years and had never told a soul. He sat alone in his study with the information and thought for a long time about what kind of man he was. He had married a woman he did not love because it was the right thing for the realm. He had built an entire life around doing what was right for the realm. He had made peace with that. And now something had shifted, something he had no practical framework for, and he was sitting in his study at midnight, thinking not about politics or bloodlines or ancient prophecy, but about a girl standing in moonlight, holding a serving tray, looking at him like she was not afraid of what she saw. He was not a man who acted on feelings. He had spent years becoming a man who did not need to. He was beginning to suspect that had been a mistake. Seraphine was perceptive, and she was not a person who ignored information. She noticed her husband's distraction. Her own sources in the court, she had several, because she had always understood that information was the most valuable thing a person could carry, brought her pieces of what the council was discussing. She assembled the pieces carefully, and arrived at a conclusion that was clear and deeply inconvenient. She did not waste energy on emotion. She decided on a plan. She arranged for Alara to be in the Great Hall during a formal court reception, a situation easily accomplished through a small manipulation of the staff schedule. And she arranged for there to be a moment, manufactured carefully, in which Alara's wrist would be seen. She had expected the court to recoil. She had expected questions to be raised about Alara's presence in the palace, about what the mark meant, about whether it posed some kind of danger. She had not expected Calum. When Alara stood in the center of the great hall, with the mark visible and blazing on her wrist, her face composed with a kind of frightened dignity that silenced the room, Calum came down from the dais. He walked through the assembled court without looking at any of them. He crossed the floor and stood beside her, and then he turned to face his council, his nobles and his queen, and said in a voice that carried the full weight of his crown that this woman was under his protection and the matter was not open for discussion. The hall was silent. Seraphine looked at him across the room for one long moment. Then she looked away. Alara told him later, in the palace garden where no one could hear them, that she did not want any of it. She was direct about it in the way she was direct about most things, without cruelty, but without softening. She said she was a maid. She knew how to keep rooms clean, and how to fold linens correctly, and how to carry 4 things at once without dropping them. She did not know anything about prophecies or bloodlines, or what the mark meant, or what anyone expected her to do with it. She said she had spent 7 years being careful not to be a problem for anyone, and now apparently she was the largest problem in the kingdom, and she would appreciate it if someone could tell her what exactly she was supposed to do about that. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said that he did not know either, and that for what it was worth, he found her the most honest person he had spoken to in years. She looked at him the way people look at someone who has said something they were not expecting. Then she looked away at the garden. She did not say anything else that evening, but she did not leave either. The legal process took 2 months. Marin appeared before the full court and spoke the corrected prophecy in the old language, and then in plain language, so no one could claim confusion. Scholars verified the translation. 3 independent bloodline tests confirmed what the mark had already declared. The High Council ruled that the original marriage had been formed under a fundamental error. Not dishonesty, but a 300-year-old misreading that had sent every generation in the wrong direction. The law had provisions for this. It had provisions for almost everything. Seraphine negotiated her own terms, as Calum had expected she would. She was given formal alliance status, land rights, trade access, and a title that served her kingdom's interests better than a distant crown ever would have. She accepted it efficiently, shook hands where required, and left the palace on a Thursday morning with her retinue of 40, and her head at the same precise angle it had been when she arrived. She was, Alara thought, watching from a second-floor window, an extraordinary person. She hoped life gave her something she actually wanted. On the morning the amended prophecy was formally read aloud before the assembled realm, Alara stood in the great hall and kept her left wrist uncovered for the first time since she was 13 years old. She did not entirely understand what was ahead of her. She did not understand all of what the mark meant or what would be asked of her. She was not confident or comfortable or certain. She was a young woman who had spent most of her life trying not to be seen, standing in front of an entire kingdom, and the only thing she knew for certain was that she was done hiding something that had never actually been something to be ashamed of. Calum stood beside her. Not in front of her, not above her. Beside her, the way 2 people stand when they are beginning something together, instead of one of them following the other. The mark glowed steadily on her wrist, not dramatically, not like a fire, but like light through a window at the beginning of a day. Quiet, certain, ready.